Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta and we are here in the week 4 or the final installment of our discussions on textiles and allied practices, threads of visual exploration. So we have already been started talking about the issues on sustainability, its relationship to industrialization and colonization. So we will look into some of the important concepts which also make us think about sustainability in a more expansive way. So perhaps I'd start talking about some of these important aspects such as carbon footprint. So we hear this idea of carbon footprint quite a bit and in the recent times, and then in terms of if we think about what it is relationship to textile making, perhaps in one sentence I can summarize by saying that the greenhouse gas that is emitted from the product's life cycle is something that we understand as carbon footprint. And this idea that it is not just about we are talking about the making of the product but then the product's life cycle. So that means that when we are producing a product and then the entire time period for in which we are using it and whatever kind of using of this product can go on, and then what kind of energy is required for sustaining it, maintaining it, and then once the product is discarded, then what happens to it? Does that go back to nature? And how long does it take to sort of disintegrate and it can be used again in it reaches that state. So this is the entire life cycle we talk about. So sort of like starting from nature and going back to it. So this is something we can think in terms of what is understood as carbon footprint, that the greenhouse gas emission from the life cycle of a particular product can be understood as carbon footprint of that particular product. And here we are talking primarily about textiles. Now the other idea is that also equally important here, and that is perhaps the ecological footprint. And ecological footprint is something in which we find that the land or water area that is required for producing nutrition for sustaining human lives, energy for both production of objects, production of different kind of amenities, but also in terms of supporting the societies, and then also the waste treatment. So ecological footprint can be summarized as we can think about the mass of land or water that is required for producing nutrition. So when we talk about producing nutrition, we say that that is perhaps that includes agriculture and of course, like animal grazing and everything else, which provide nutrition to the human bodies, and that is how we survive. And then of course when we talk about energy, then we talk about both renewable and non-renewable sources of energy and how those can be used for supporting the societies. And then also we think about the waste management, and waste management definitely includes that when we are discarding certain kind of objects and products, what kind of state they are in. Are they ready to be thrown out in the nature, or are they require certain kind of processing and then it can be sort of sent back to the nature? So these are some of the concerns that we find, and all those things can be considered under this concept of ecological footprint. Now with that we also find that the ecological footprint is something in which the water, different kind of energy sources and different modes of resources, all of those things are used in different aspects of textile making. So if we think about the production of textile, if I take plant-based fibers, for example cotton, so we can think about the amount of water, sunlight, then perhaps some kind of fertilizer and everything else, those are required simultaneously with the human involvement, the human labor for production or cultivation of cotton. And then after the cotton is collected, then it is ginned and then spun, and then it is made into yarn, and then all those things, they require a lot of human labor, but also at the same time it might also require machinery involvement, because in a lot of places we do find that how even in the handmade textile sectors, spinning and ginning, this processes are a lot of times they are done by a simple machinery setup, and that certainly reduces the human labor in the process. But I mean, of course, I mean it requires continuous supervision. So this is something we find, that how different pre-production processes, that they require different kind of energy, and all of them, they certainly go back to this idea of ecological footprint. And then once the textile is made, and if we are thinking in terms of dyed textile, brocade, whatever it is, then different kinds of energy, those will be required. In some textile production, for example dyed textile making, we see extensive use of water, sunlight, those are required. And then also if it requires boiling, then we need firewood or different kind of fuel for boiling them, etc. So these are different kinds of energy sources we certainly require for making the textiles. And then when we think about the textiles when they are used, so when using of the textile, it certainly we can think about using normal water, but also if we are putting them in the washing machine, then what kind of energy that requires for maintaining the textiles for the period of time when we need it. After the textiles are used, when we are discarding them, a lot of times they are also used as landfills. And with the growth of urbanization, we find that the landfill is something that has been evidenced across the globe. And this is a way in which we find that the items and the garbage, and of course, like I mean, all of them are discarded items, the ones which cannot be processed, and they are usually used as this landfill. But then what kind of impact does it make, and then how long does it take for them to be reintegrated into the soil? So those are some of the questions we might think about, that when we talk about ecological footprint. So there are many ways in which we have to consider that what is the relationship between textile making, so the pre-production, post-production, usage, and then after we discard them. So the entire process, the entire life cycle, it has a huge impact, and we can think about how the ecological footprint can be a useful concept to think about its impact in our lives. Now, with those things, we find that designer and scholar Rebecca Rubens, she had spoken about this idea of holistic sustainability. And holistic sustainability is something in which we be more aware of what kind of sustainable practices we need to embrace, and what kind of sustainable practices perhaps can prioritized for the growth of our societies. So in this case, in terms of the holistic approach for sustainability, Rebecca Rubens suggests that, I mean, we think about sustainability in much more expansive terms, where ecological and environmental concerns need to be simultaneously considered with socio-cultural aspects as well as economic sustainability. So when we think about this idea of holistic sustainability, we be aware that this is not just about our environment, but there are many different ways of our lives which are all equally affected by sustainable or non-sustainable practices. So for example, if we think about some of the materials that we use for textile making, or for different kinds of practices which may include craft practices and the other practices which result into objects of our daily usage. So if there are renewable sources, for example the ones that come from biosphere, that means like cotton, different kind of plant-based sources, they are the ones which are easy to be sort of disintegrated, and those are the ones we find them that they are much more sustainable compared to the ones which we extract as like in form of mineral resources, etc. So for example, what we understand as renewable sources, that something that we use, it goes back to the nature, and perhaps like similar kind of things can come up again, and it is renewed over time. It is not something that it is not irreversible. But the ways in which we perhaps see the use of fuel, the use of coal, etc., this mineral sources, and those are the ones we find that once it is used, it cannot be generated in the next 500 years or in the next few thousand years. So this is something that we understand as non-renewable sources. So in holistic sustainability, in the model of holistic sustainability, we do think about this environmental concerns, the ecological concerns, but also think about a lot of other issues which are prevalent in our societies. So for example, in the craft sector, we find that there are certain aspects about the mass migration of artisans from one sector to another. Perhaps in a lot of times we find that with the loss of jobs, with the loss of patronage and opportunities, a lot of artisans, they move from the artisanal works to something that is perhaps something that can support their lives, but then like their skills do not sustain. So for example, during my field work in Machilipatnam in coastal Andhra Pradesh, I have learned that how the master block makers, they teach block making to a lot of youngsters, but then a lot of them, they cannot really sustain in the field, and then they eventually go and work as helpers in sari shops and in different kinds of shops. And jokingly, the block makers would say that that would enable them to sit in an AC shop or in an AC room for the entire day. But then perhaps like all that in the entire day, all they can do is to fold and unfold saris or fabrics and show it to the customers. They can have conversations, but there is nothing they can do with their hands in terms of when a block maker makes a block, the kind of engagement that it requires with the tools and also with their eyes, with their brain. So all those engagement gets completely lost in this process. So if we think about that, if someone who's trained in a particular sector, and then the sector sort of shifts, their workplace shifts, then what are the kind of things we can consider in that case? That if the person is making more economic capital with that or not, that is something is always a concern for sustaining lives. But also at the same time, perhaps once we think about this idea of holistic sustainability, we can consider that sustainability is not just about sustaining our lives, meeting the basic or the bare minimum, but it is also about sustaining and nurturing our skill set, sustaining and nurturing our ability to think, to do, and to take actions. So those kind of issues are also very much part of sustaining certain kind of practices, and this is something we need to always consider, that in our discussions about sustainability, it is not just ecology and environment, but then socio-cultural sustainability is highly significant in those terms. Now, I guess one of the issues that also comes up for the craftspeople, it is about the unfamiliarity with the global markets, and this is something that had come up again and again, and in multiple conversations that I had during my field works with printers, with weavers, and different other textile makers, we find them that they have always spoken about there is a lack of communication, and how if they speak in the regional languages, the languages which are prevalent in particular regions, but then not knowing English or not knowing the norms in which the urban market or the multinational this e-commerce platforms they function. So that certainly leaves them out of the opportunities which can be useful for sustaining their craft practices, also supporting their families and communities in a better way. So this is something we can also consider, that sustainability should not just include being ecologically, environmentally aware. It's not also just about thinking that how our skills can be used and not, but this is also, it puts a tremendous amount of stress on certain kind of skill development, certain kind of communication between people, perhaps the ones who are more aware of the market systems, and then the ones who are perhaps more sort of involved in the hands-on artisanal production. So the ways in which we see that the traders and the producers, they have survived in the pre-industrial paradigm, is something we have to think about, that how this communication, the exchanges between communities, skill sharing, this kind of activities need to be more and more prioritized, in which perhaps one can learn something from the other, and that is how the sustainability of a craft or a practice can go on further. So these are perhaps there are also scopes in which we can think about that how the designer's role can be, and we will come to the role of the designer perhaps in later in our discussion. But this is also something for us to think about, that how sustainability or holistic sustainability, it is not just something we can consider about being aware of the materials we are using, what kind of energy sources we are exhausting when we are producing certain things, but it is also in terms of thinking about the conditions of life and livelihood of the communities who produce, the communities who get engaged in circulating products, circulating knowledge, and all of us, how we are connected to them. So holistic sustainability must include all these different kinds of concerns. Now, as I have mentioned, that how this notion of sustainability, that certainly sort of takes our attention to a much more expansive platform, where we talk about ecological sustainability in relation to social, cultural, and economic sustainability. So we will come to discuss all those aspects one after another. Now, perhaps another thing we have to think about when we talk about sustainability in textile practices, and then also its impact on our lives, we cannot ignore the aspect of fashion. And fashion, we see that, I mean, this is a very interesting concept, which has featured in the scholarly discussions in many different ways. So in the much more sort of in the scholarly way of describing what fashion is, we find that it is usually been considered as a way of communication, and it is a way of communication of our cultural needs, our individual vision, and to the society. So it is a kind of way in which we can think that, I mean, how our individual vision, our aims, our aspirations can be communicated to the society, and it is also a culturally rooted system, or a culturally rooted way of sort of communicating these ideas to the society. So it can operate as an individual, but it can also operate as something, as a collective way of operating. Now the thing is that, I mean, but then when we hear the word fashion, we usually think about something which is quite the opposite of this line of thought. So when we talk about fashion, a lot of times we do think that, I mean, how something that is transient, which is very much on time, which is very much in trend, and that is something we find, I mean, that is which takes us to the present moment, but then this present is not something that is always been consciously connected to the past and the future. Even though a lot of times the textile historians, the fashion historians have shown and have established it, that how fashion always returns after a particular point in time. But even after that, we find that fashion is usually something that is understood as very much being on trend and being very much present at this particular point in time. And it is also something that is understood as transient, that we see. So for example, when we think about fashion, and we also think and fashion in relation to textile making and manufacturing, we see this idea of the seasonal connections, the spring collection, autumn collection, etc., etc., and in which we find that there are particular kinds of clothes which are produced, clothes and other textiles which are used by us in the interior setup. So this kind of fabrics which are produced, the fabrics and the clothes, they are very much in tune with a particular season. They are very much in tune with something of a very short period of time, and the short period of time is very important for the manufacturing the organizations. And that's because that, I mean, if we consider something that can be used again and again for years, then there is not really much scope of producing more. There is not really much scope of mass production. But then for the seasonal collection, the issue that is sort of emphasized is that, I mean, particular kind of clothes are required in particular seasons, and that to not seasons every year, but like, I mean, in a season in one particular year. So this is something that, I mean, it's a kind of a given precondition in which we find that fashion usually operates in a social circle. And in that sense, we also find that if, like, the scholarly definition sort of comes to suggest that fashion is a way of communicating our individual needs or individual visions to the society, but then in this case, our individual visions are actually governed by particular organizations. If an organization suggests that this is a spring summer collection, and if we do not subscribe to that, then we fall behind. So this is a kind of idea that we do not really see all the time, that our individual vision is communicated by what we prefer, but it is also a way in which we can see that how we can be aligned with particular visions which are already been there in the society. So this idea of individuality that becomes kind of really complicated, that finding individuality by aligning ourselves with particular organizations or brands, and which already have global repute. So this is a way in which we find that there are inherent contradictions in this term fashion, perhaps in the ways in which we see that how it has its scholarly context, but also then how we see that this idea of fashion sort of translates into the practices that are prevalent in our societies. So with that, I'd also like to sort of bring our attention back to this idea of sustainability. Now, when we talk about sustainability and the definition that we have looked at so far, in that definition we have looked into sustainability as a way of communicating between past, present and future, or being in the present and then also drawing from the past, and then being mindful about future. So in a way, we see this temporal system kind of comes alive when we think about this holistic sustainability model. But then when we talk about the seasons in fashion, a season being a short-lived transient moment in a particular point in time which is very trendy, but then it might not return. So if this is something that we find as the seasons in fashion, that is just one temporal moment we are talking about. So speaking through this concepts, we find that the idea of sustainability and the idea of the seasons in fashion, they are quite the opposite in which we can see it. So and this is also something we find that in some of the recent scholarship, people have reached out to different group of people. The scholars have reached out to different groups of people and have asked that what kind of views they hold for understanding fashion, understanding this idea of seasons, and also understanding this idea of sustainable practices. So a lot of times people, depending on, like, I mean, their background, we find that the answers have also changed. In one of the recent works, we have seen that how Scandinavian regions, when the craft teachers, the and of course that the art students, when they are asked about what can be their preferences, so people have that commented upon how sustainable practices, or perhaps, like, I mean, the kind of clothes which can be worn for an extended period of time, as opposed to the ones which are just suitable for one season, can be useful. But then with the group of people, when this particular setup changes, then we have also seen that how the seasonal collections, they get much more priority. So it also says something about that the consumers are not really homogeneous across the globe, which is a given fact. But then we think that, I mean, how our preferences, they might also change with our inclination and alignment, also awareness of particular kind of design paradigm, and at the same time that how we are aware of certain kind of systems of operation. So these are some of the issues we can think about, that how the idea of temporality is ingrained in the idea of both sustainability and fashion. Now, thinking about the different kinds of sustainability, first I would like to address this idea of ecological parameters and sustainability. That, I mean, what is ecological sustainability? How do we think about that? So definitely we do see that, I mean, ecological parameters, or the ecology and environment, these two terms being almost interchangeable, we find that, I mean, they play a big role in terms of understanding, as I have already mentioned, that pre-production of textiles, lifespan of textile, at the same time the afterlife of textiles when they are discarded, and what happens with that. So the ecological parameters, they play a huge role. And then how that also impacts upon sustainability, we find that there are different kind of ecological conditions those are created, and those ecological conditions also make a huge deal of impact on the ways in which textiles are produced. So perhaps this is something we can think about, that this, when in our discussion we see that ecological conditions or ecological sustainability, and how that operates in the field of textile making, instead of giving all of you the different tables or the accounts in which, like, I mean, it affects or not, perhaps I will be taking a different approach. I will be going through certain narratives, and also give us some of the examples from the history as well as from the recent past or the contemporary period, to make us understand about the relationship between ecology and also textile making. Some of these aspects are perhaps already been addressed in the earlier lectures and the discussions as well, but in this case what we will do is we will look into them exclusively from the perspective of ecology and environment. So those are the things we will start discussing, and we will continue the discussion perhaps in the next lecture. Thank you.